Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. When I was dead broke, I couldn't picture that Sega wouldn't make consoles anymore. Sorry, Biggie, but Sega has been out of the console game since about 2001. Sega is still around though, but nowadays they stay firmly on the software side of gaming, except for when they want to cash in on nostalgia.
Go on about how amazing I am.
In this video, TheGamer is taking you through the history of Sega. From its climatic rise to meteoric fall and struggle to release more than one good Sonic game every decade, it's all here. Get ready, because you're about to learn where Sega's been, what they're doing now, and where the company's going.
Great question. I have no idea.
Today, Sega is an international video game developer and publisher. The company is far older than most realize though, as Sega only became a recognized brand in the US in the late 80s and early 90s. Sega, as we know it today, first took shape in the 1940s with the creation of standard games. This company was founded by American businessmen in Hawaii to provide arcade machines to military bases in World War II. While the company was successful in selling a lot of pinball and slot machines, it liquidated its assets and rebranded after the war. Now Service Games, the company set its sights on supplying slot machines to US bases in Japan, since pinball and slot machines were getting a bad rep in the US. Seriously, slot machines were straight up illegal in the US in the 50s. And people were wailing on pinball machines with sledgehammers. Kinda makes the people who were legitimately angry about the censorship and TMS-FE seem even sillier by comparison, huh? BTW, Sega also had a hand in making that game, but we'll get there in a minute. And time will fly by even faster if you make sure to like this video and subscribe to TheGamer while you're watching. Alright, so Service Games was very successful in selling slot machines in Japan, and even expanded into other nations on the Pacific Coast. Service Games started abbreviating their name to Sega, and put that label on their machines in the mid-50s. However, the company was apparently up to some shady stuff in Japan, and was forced to dissolve in 1960. Undeterred, Sega's founders created two shell companies that bought up all of their former assets and then merged into a single company a few years later. Together again in the mid-60s, the company placed more focus on manufacturing its own slot machines. Sega also leaned into making other coin-operated games and devices, like photo booths, jukeboxes, and pinball machines. Sega would find massive success manufacturing games with the light-based shooting gallery title Periscope. The company started releasing several arcade games a year after this and were so successful that an American conglomerate bought it and officially named it Sega Enterprises. Sega would see tremendous success in the arcade boom of the late 70s, and even managed to license and release Frogger in 1981. But they had a difficult time getting into the home gaming market after the arcade bubble burst in the early 80s though. Sega's first two consoles, the SG-1000 and Master System, were largely beaten out by Nintendo and Atari. However, the Master System would become the console of choice in Europe at the time. Then, the late 80s hit and Sega once again became one of the biggest names in video games. Arcades were on the upswing again, and the console wars were in full force as the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive faced off against the SNES. This period was more or less Sega's golden years, with the release of the first Sonic the Hedgehog game nearly cementing Sega's fledgling gaming empire. However, some questionable business decisions led to Sega's long fall from the top of the ladder. Sega tried investing in a handheld gaming system, the Game Gear, to compete with Nintendo's Game Boy, but saw it quickly flop. This was mostly due to tech limitations and a lack of original games for the portable system. The company also tried releasing add-ons for the Sega Genesis, like the Sega CD. This edition allowed the system to read CD-ROMs, but the lofty $300 price point didn't entice consumers. Sega's next console, the Sega Saturn, would also underperform, thanks to scant ads for the system and its staggering $400 price point. The mid to late 90s would be difficult for Sega, but they'd try to recover with the launch of the Sega Dreamcast at the end of the decade. While the system was impressive and ahead of its time, it didn't do well enough to make up for their poor performance in the past console generation. It also didn't help that the arcade market was rapidly shrinking at the time, cutting deep into Sega's revenue. With few other options and the company basically hemorrhaging money in the early 2000s, Sega decided to stop making consoles and refocus its efforts and brand. That more or less brings us to Sega's Present. In 2004, the Sammy Corporation bought a controlling share of Sega's stock and took over the company. Following this buyout, Sega divided its efforts into 4 major fields. Those were video game software development and licensing, expanding their arcade catalog, developing theme parks, and selling pachinko and other gambling machines. Sega's continued video game development is by far the most interesting part of the company today, and how they're keeping the childhoods of millions of people alive. Sega has released more than 50 games since Sammy took over. Some of these games are iconic and instantly recognizable, while others are a bit more bizarre. Sonic the Hedgehog is still Sega's mascot, and the company still releases a new Sonic game every 2 or 3 years. Sadly, the quality of those games vary greatly, with Sonic's shift to 3D proving divisive among fans. Additionally, trend chasing as seen in the super edgy Shadow the Hedgehog game and the many conflicting Sonic cartoons and comics has muddled Sonic's image. The character and franchise mean a lot of different things to different people, which all but guarantees that a portion of the Sonic fanbase will be disappointed with every new release. 2017's Sonic Mania was a somewhat unifying title and a kind of reimagining of the original Sonic games and other classic Sega titles. This game was actually developed by indie studios Pagoda West Games and Headcanon Studios. Sonic Mania was largely made by prominent members of the Sonic fan game community, and their passion for the series definitely shows through. Then there's the Sonic the Hedgehog movie, which is distributed by Paramount Pictures. Sega does have a production credit in the film and did offer creative insight, but the actual extent of their involvement is pretty vague. The same is true for the Sonic franchise as a whole. The latest entry in the series, Sonic Forces, was a 3D game that saw mixed reviews, but performed strongly, according to Sega. So anything can happen next for the Blue Blur. Of course, Sega is more than just Sonic. The Yakuza series is bigger than ever, and also directly owned and published by Sega. Focusing on the world's nicest and morally conscious Yakuza member, the games have built up a die-hard fan base since the first entry launched in 2005. With a mix of larger-than-life characters, outrageous fights and side quests, and a dense open world, there's a lot of love in the Yakuza games. Sega also has an impressive collection of games that it licensed or outright acquired through corporate buyouts. Atlus, the company behind the Persona games, is a direct subsidiary of Sega, meaning that all of Atlus's games fall under Sega's banner. While a lot of Atlus's games are still finding their footing in the West, the Persona series smashed into the mainstream with the recent release of Persona 5. Combining turn-based strategy with terrific character writing and an awesome anime aesthetic, it's easy to see why Persona 5 was such a hit. Sega also licenses the Hatsune Miku series of rhythm games. These games were instrumental in creating the Virtual Singer's global popularity. So if you hit up Coachella this year and see a bunch of people confused by a hologram anime girl on stage, you can thank Sega for that. Sega also has a number of projects in the works that are set to be released this year. The experimental turn-based Yakuza 7 is already out in Japan, and should be released globally before the end of 2020. Then there's everything happening with Persona 5. A spin-off that some are describing as a direct sequel titled Persona 5 Scramble comes out in Japan this February. This game will see the Phantom Thieves face off against hordes of enemies in Dynasty Warriors-style gameplay. While there's no Western release date set yet, fans are obviously hungry for more Persona 5 content. Thankfully, they'll get just that with the March release of Persona 5 Royal. This game releases worldwide in March and is an enhanced edition of Persona 5. There are new plot lines, characters, battles, and pretty much everything you want if you're looking to put another 80+ hours of Persona 5 into your life. Between all these projects and Sega's continued investment in VR games, it's clear that the company is alive and maybe even doing better than ever. Now it's time to take a look at the future of Sega. It's pretty clear that another console just isn't in the cards for the company. They might do an enhanced Sega Genesis Mini or even a Dreamcast Mini, but they probably won't try out a new console ever again. Why would Sega make a new console when they're making so much money from developing games and face such stiff competition from Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft in the console market? Instead, the company will likely continue expanding old IPs and acquiring new brands to fill out its portfolio. Sega has expressed almost no interest in developing new franchises in the past 5 years or so, which implies that they're okay with just padding out their current roster. Also, no, Judgment was a Yakuza spin-off and doesn't count as a new series. Beyond that, Sega will probably keep making film and television versions of their biggest properties. There's definitely going to be another Sonic cartoon before too long, even if it'll be impossible for a new series to top the zany charm of the Sonic Boom show. Even if the Persona 5 anime saw a mixed response, it also wouldn't be surprising if we saw an anime adaptation of the Yakuza games at some point. Oh, Sega will also probably have Atlus release Shin Megami Tensei 5 eventually, but there's no telling when. Fans of the long-running franchise have been desperate to learn more about this confirmed title for years, but Sega is keeping most of that info under lock and key. Honestly, Sega's future looks like more of the same. After stumbling out of the console scene and barely putting itself back together, things are looking pretty good for Sega now. Every new Sonic game is all but guaranteed to sell at least 1 million copies. And people are still passionate about their other legacy franchises. So long as Sega keeps expanding these franchises with okay to good games, they should remain a part of the gaming industry for years to come. Even if they're not going to dominate the field like they used to, it's clear that there's room in the gaming sphere for Sega. Even if nostalgia is keeping the company alive more than anything else at this point, sometimes that's exactly what you want as a game developer. So long as you want a little Sega in your life, the company is happy to give you a new Sonic, Persona, or Yakuza game every few years. What do you think of Sega's history and future? Let us know in the comments section down below. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to TheGamer for more. If you ring the bell, you'll get a notification every time we upload a new video breaking down some of the biggest names in gaming.